Because that question just really, really got to me. Because I went to this whole and then I couldn't do it.
Even though it's free. That's sweet right there. Oh, well, mustard, there's no tomato. Is that what you just do each week, Sam? You just wander around university looking for a free lunch?
It's certainly not what you do. Are you telling me actively ignore free lunches?
I don't actively ignore them, but I don't go seeking the university for them either.
Neither do I, but I saw people eating hot dogs and more people crowding around than people willing to pay. And so I was like, they must be free.
That was the French Association of is that the
Finance.
You've got no idea. You're just like free sausage.
No, it's the Finance Association.
Finance Association.
The business school students are so confused. They're in hell, like, in here learning business, such a free lunch, and then straight outside. It's free lunch.
I think that should make them think as to whether it's genuinely free or not. Sorry?
Like the presence of our metaphysics class in the business school is rattling everything up.
Yeah, that's what's happening. We're inducing strange metaphysical paradoxes by being here. Those are sausages from the future.
And then not
They're both tasty, but also not tasty.
Is there a significance to the picture, or do you just like it?
I just liked it.
It was the first intertemporal photo we've ever taken.
Wow, it's kind of like this.
The way the mountains are fading into the background makes it look like they're lying up there. Pretty sure you can get some metaphysical significance out of that.
I just thought it was pretty.
Pretty.
Isn't it pretty?
I'm not saying it's not good.
And it feels old.
So that's, yeah.
So it feels tiny.
Yeah.
I think it calls to mind the void.
Calls to mind the void.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Okay, so first of all, Sam, that's I know that free lunch is exciting, but try and contain yourself. Before I get going, I want to talk about the last lecture. So there is another lecture scheduled. It's a sort of review lecture, whatever that is. What I was thinking of doing is moving the discussion of exam prep into that lecture, because then it will be recorded and you can access it later on when you're actually thinking about exams, rather than right now when the last thing you're probably thinking about is exams. And just cancel our last workshop, because the last workshop was going to be on exam preppy stuff, but I think I can cover it in a lecture. And also we can use that lecture for Q&A if you've got questions about anything in the course. Okay? Any objections, thoughts? Yeah.
If you were hoping to use the last tutorial to get your last mark when your tutorial attendance up.
Not my problem. The last two are optional anyway, I've declared, so even if you came to that last tutorial, it wouldn't be assessed, so. Did I say that? Shit. Why did I say that?
Why don't you just give everyone attendance at the last day?
No.
If you come to the lecture on Monday, that's counts.
All right, if you come to the lecture on Monday, I'll give you an attendance mark for that. If you've missed a tute and you want to make it up, you come to that lecture, then that means everyone's going to come to the lecture. That means I have to come.
How many of everything do we have left?
How many of everything do we have left?
Last week I loved it.
We've got an infinite amount of everything left.
Oh, that's not helpful.
It's not helpful at all. It's actively unhelpful, I think. Yeah. We've got a workshop this week, and then that's it.
Oh, okay. And then one more lecture.
And then one more lecture, and then that's it. Yeah. This is the last lecture that has content, right? The next lecture will have, well, I mean, by like metaphysics-related content. The next lecture will just be like, here's how to do well in an exam, and then. In the tutorial this week, we're doing what we were doing last week, which is going through essay outlines. So anyone who wants to talk about their essay can give a presentation on it, and then we can talk about problems that they're having and try and work through those problems.
So that's one of the optional ones?
Yeah. Yeah, so you don't have to come this week if you don't want to. But you can make up attendance marks. Yeah.
So we are.
This week, but not next week. But we're having a lecture next week. I'll send out an email. That makes this all clear and sets it in stone so that there's no misunderstandings. Okay? All right, cool. If you have missed a tutorial and you want to make it up, what I suggest you do is you build a time machine and you travel back and you go to the tutorial. Because I don't know if you guys noticed, but there were a couple of people that have turned up to some of the tutorials but have never turned up to another tutorial since, right? Doesn't that tip you off to the fact that maybe they were time travelers? Shh! Time travelers! All right. Okay, so last time I was talking to you about coincidences, right? This idea that if you send thousands of people back in time repeatedly, that they will end up inducing all of these coincidences if they repeatedly try to kill their grandfathers or their infant selves or whatever, right? And Paul Horwich argued that this doesn't make time travel impossible, but it makes it extremely unlikely, right? Because it would seem to imply the existence of all of these coincidences. The way of addressing that sort of worry was to say, well, look, what's coincidental and what's not is really relative to a context, right? And so if you're in a context in which you see lots of people running around repeatedly being subject to gun jammings and so on, then you would no longer see it as coincidental, right? You would start to see these as, you know, likely events. The fact that we don't see that around us at the moment, we don't see people running around trying to kill old people and repeatedly failing. The fact that we don't see that suggests that at best that there aren't any time travelers traveling to our local time, right? But it doesn't tell you that time travel is improbable, it doesn't tell you that it's impossible, okay? Then looked at a way to try and kill your grandfather if you really want to, right? I know that you've all got this burning desire to induce a contradiction. And some people have argued that you can kill your grandfather if you've got a second time dimension. We also talked a little bit about branching time. I'm not really sure that there's much of a difference between these two ideas, really. That in both cases, what you sort of have is a different temporal axis of some kind, whether it's a branch or a dimension to play with. And when you've got those alternative temporal axes, then you could have grandfather survive in one axis and be killed in the other axis. And as long as the thing that you kill is a part of the man that you know and hate, then you can say that you've managed to kill grandfather. What we saw was that even in those cases, you could formulate a kind of hypertemporal paradox, where you have beings traveling through this alternative temporal axis and attempting to kill their progenitors and subsequently failing to do so, right? I just don't think hypertime or adding n dimensions of time really helps you to get around these problems, right? At best, it allows you to sort of avoid certain things, right? So you might be able to make it to a different past in which your grandfather died, but it's not the past that you left, and it's not really the thing that you were trying to do if you managed to kill grandfather. What you wanted to do was kill the guy that had all the horrible causal effects in your life, right? And that's just what you can't do. At best, you can go and kill some part of him that just didn't really have much to do with you as you were growing up at all. Yeah.
Do you have to do something like try and kill your grandfather to, because you mentioned that any time had kind of changed the past, but merely the fact that you travelled back and then existed in the past, it would then be the case that it was true that you didn't exist, say, in 1850, and it would also be not true that you didn't exist in 1850.
Only if it's true that you didn't exist in 1850, right? So it's true that any travel into the past means bringing about some past event, right? But what we should say about that case is that you were always there in the past, right? The fact that you don't know that you were always there in the past, right, that you travelled back, just suggests that you've got some kind of epistemic limitation. If you had full knowledge about the past at the time you stepped in the time machine, you would know that you travelled back, right, and that you stepped out of a time machine. You know, you've got similar things with people who, you know, don't remember meeting their former selves or something like that. You can sort of raise similar sorts of issues. But again, it's just, there are lots of ways that our memory can fail, that our epistemology can fail, that I think can account for these sorts of cases. On the other hand, it's certainly the case that doing anything to change the past, where you bring it about that something that was past is past no longer, or something that was a part of the past is not a part any longer, anything, doesn't have to be killing your grandfather or trying to kill your infant self, anything like that is going to induce a contradiction, and it's going to be impossible. Yes. Yeah, you could be your own grandfather. And that falls under a class of paradoxes which I didn't get to last week, that I think of as informational paradoxes. These are cases in which, you know, the easiest one is that someone comes to your door someday, they've got plans for a time machine, they give you the plans for the time machine, you grow up, you build a time machine, you travel back, you give the plans to yourself, right? Question is, where did the information come from, right? Who invented the time machine? It kind of looks like no one invented the time machine. The information was just sort of always there. Similarly, if you're your own grandfather, you might ask, where did the genetic information come from, right? They're all sort of a class of the same informational weirdness. But I think that when you've got a four-dimensional picture of time, all this, the sort of answer is, you know, the information was just always part of the universe, right? Okay. Yeah, oh, that's right. We were able to kill grandfather. He wasn't very happy about that. Also, he has cold, dead eyes. All right, so now I'm going to think about the interplay between time travel and the different models of time that we've looked at. Because most people think about time travel in terms of the static theory of time, right? The eternalist picture of time, according to which past, present, and future all exist equally, and there's no metaphysical moving present, right? There's no metaphysically robust distinction between the past, present, and future. But what happens when you do have a metaphysically robust distinction between the past, present, and future, and you throw time travel into the mix as well? Okay? We're going to look at some problems that come up when you try and time travel in a branch attrition world, in a growing block world, and in a presentist world. Okay? All right, so just to remind you, moving spotlight theory. Moving spotlight theorist argues that the present moves across time like a spotlight moving across a wall, some kind of metaphysically robust property of presentness. that each time takes on in turn. If that phrase worries you, then it should. In turn is sort of a temporal notion. Anyway, hard stuff. Growing block theory, the past and the present exist, the future doesn't exist, but you know, the sum total of reality grows as things come into existence over time. Right. Third one, branch attrition. You've got, at some node, this structure of branches that spring out from the node. As time moves on, branches fall off the tree, and you end up with this one single line. In some sense, the end of the world in a growing block world, like the end of the universe, the end of time, the universe looks exactly the same in a growing block world as it does in a branch attrition world. And then, of course, our good friend presentism, which we all love to hate. The idea that only present entities exist and that past and future entities don't exist. Okay. So as I said, we've been working with this thing when we're thinking about time travel. It's much easier to think about time travel in an eternalist world. I mean, for the very simple reason that if the past is already out there in existence and it's sort of space-like anyway, then traveling to the past doesn't seem overly problematic, right? But what happens when the past isn't there, as under presentism, right? What happens when the future gradually comes into existence, as under the growing block view? What happens when branches fall off, as under the branch attrition view? All right. What? You don't like my diagram? You do better. All right. So look, I mean, this is top notch. This graphical representation. Okay. So Tim the time traveler travels back in time to try and kill his grandfather. Right now we're in a branching universe. Okay. This is just to speak to some of the things that people were talking about last week about branching and how you can kill your grandfather with branching time. I'll come to branch attrition in a sec. The idea with a branching solution, it's very similar to the hypertime solution. In the hypertime solution, you travel back you travel through a different time dimension and meet a part of your grandfather in a different time dimension. You kill him. He never gives birth to you. Well, obviously he doesn't do that, but you know what I mean. He never gives rise to you via a causal chain. If you've got a branching structure, then you can do a similar thing. What you can do is you can travel back in time. You can't bring it about that you killed the grandfather who caused you, arguably. What you can do, though, is travel back in time and go on a different branch along which grandfather didn't exist, right? So if you think about this big branching structure, there's a branch here that grandfather survived on, but there's a branch here that grandfather didn't survive on. And what you can do on a branching model is travel back here, kill grandfather, and head on down this branch, right? I mean, I say that, and this actually, if you were watching Back to the Future 2 last night like I was, Doc Brown tries to describe this in terms of branching timelines, right? What happens that when you travel back here, a new timeline is created by your actions. I'm not sure we want to say that. What we want to say is that it always was the case here that there were two options that were actually realized, and that the time traveler went down one option, but that grandfather went up the other option. It's not the case that you're killing grandfather creates the branch, because that's going to start to look a bit weird pretty quickly, I think. Yeah. Do they have a story about how the branches are separated? I don't think they add another dimension. I don't think you need to. You can just think about space-time as branching in such a way that you have causally disconnected regions in space-time. Yeah, you can throw another dimension in there. I don't think you need to throw another dimension in there, right? You can just have regions of space-time that are causally disconnected from each other, in which, the events on one branch are different to the events that happen on the other branch. Yeah?
Presumably, if you extrapolate out from this, is it safe to say that considering whatever your action is in the past, whether it's killing your grandfather or cherry on the kettle or other
Yeah.
that there is basically an infinite number of different branches in this massive...
Yeah, I mean, this comes to the issue of what the branches are, right? I mean, if the branches are like representing every possibility, right? If it's like taking the sum total of physical possibilities and crunching them into a single world, then it might well be an infinite number of branches, but it really depends on what the branches are. They might not be infinite. If there's only like 2 physically possible ways for something to happen, then there's only going to be 2 branches, right? But if there's an infinite number of ways that something can happen physically speaking, then there's going to be an infinite number of branches, right? So it depends on the event you're looking at, right? You might think that there's only 2 physically possible ways to bring it about that this building explodes, right? So there's just 2 branches, one in which it explodes in one way, one in which it explodes in the other way, right? But another event might be far more easily determined, right? There might be many things you could do to bring it about. I haven't seen Men in Black 3. I stopped after Men in Black 2 because...
It's terrible, like, storyline-wise, but it kind of covers, like, a structure of time like that. There's a guy who exists on, like, all...
Oh, he exists on all branches. Yeah, Lewis talks about this. He talks about people who exist on all branches, and he takes... So any of you doing moral theory, imagine you start using consequentialism, right, but across all of the branches, right? And you start having to do utility calculations about what your action is going to do on all of the possible branches. And Lewis actually showed that consequentialism breaks in these situations when you've got an infinite number of branches, because whatever you do, right, you're going to get an infinite amount of utility or an infinite amount of disutility, but you're not ever going to be able to make a difference to the sum total of utility in the universe. Fascinating. Thanks, Lewis. Okay, so something to keep in mind here is that a paradox can always be reformulated within a branch, right? Look, you can travel back and you can avoid the branch that you grew up living on, right, by killing grandfather. But what you can't do is travel back and kill grandfather in the branch that you exist in, right? Because that's going to induce the same kind of contradiction that the grandfather paradox always involved, right? So if you're on this branch, you think of this branch as the past, right? And you travel back here and you bring it about relative to this branch that grandfather existed and he didn't exist, then that's just the same paradox as in the ordinary grandfather paradox. That's why I don't think these branching models really do much to help us out. What you can do is you can avoid things that you don't want to live through, you can kill people that are sort of similar to your grandfather or even parts of your grandfather, but you can't really ever do the thing that you really wanted to do, which is kill the man who caused you all that grief when you were young, right? There are actually some moral questions that arise here.
If your grandfather abused you as a child and you go back and kill him before he had you abused you as a child, are you actually killing someone who abused you as a child? What's that case?
Yeah, but you're also doing something that's impossible, right? So, so it's like, if this impossible thing happened, what would follow for moral theory? I don't know. But to be fair, many moral questions actually involve reasoning from impossibilities, right? Because if a lot of moral theorists think that moral theories are, if true, they're necessarily true, right? So if consequentialism is true, then it's necessarily true. So if I make the following claim, what if consequentialism had been false, right? And this duty had been the thing that I had to do, what would have followed then? I'm actually reasoning from an impossibility in the same way that you are when you're thinking in a time travel case. Someone's written a paper on ethics and time travel. I think we should teach a course on it.
What if you do create a new branch? Let's say destroy one of your
Yeah, look, it might. It might if... Yeah, it might. If you have this... I mean, then you're... So there's 2 things to say about this. One of them is that think about the power you have, right, to create new branches of the universe. I mean, whoa. Second, are you traveling through time? Or are you... Like, is your machine a time machine? Or is it a creation and destruction machine? Right? It's not obvious to me that it's simply a time machine anymore. And so should we think that those kinds of creation and destruction machines are possible? I don't know. I mean, the physics tells us that maybe time machines are possible, but I'm not sure about those things which allow you to, like, destroy entire branches of the universe. Right? Sounds a bit scary. So.
The whole point of the branch attrition is that...
This isn't branch attrition yet. No. This is just a static view in which all the branches exist. You can save that for later. Branch attrition. There we go. Okay, so the branch attrition. Hopefully you can see the problem that's going to arise here, right? Let's suppose that Tim, on this branch here, when the past is back here, travels back to the year 2000. Okay? He comes from this branch. Then when the present moves on, the branch that he came from disappears, right? Goes out of existence, right? This is perfectly compatible with the branch attrition model, which says that, as the present moves on, these branches fall off the universe, right? So you could have someone, before the branches fall off, travel down one of them into the present, and then once the present has moved on, their branch has fallen off. So what does this mean? Well, it looks like when the branch is there, right, it seems true that Tim was a time traveler in 2000, right? If Tim were to say to everyone, look, I come from the year 2040, I'm a time traveler, and that branch exists, we'd all be like, yeah, you're a time traveler, right? When the branch moves on, like the present moves on and that branch falls off, right? According to the branch attrition view, remember, those branches never existed once the present moves on. It's not just that they fall off and that they used to be there. The branch attrition person says that the branches never existed, right? So Tim never traveled back in time, and yet here he is in the year 2000. So it seems to be the case that as the present moves on, it goes from being true that he's a time traveler in the year 2000 to being false that he's a time traveler in the year 2000. This looks like changing the past. This looks like changing the past in exactly the same way that you have in the ordinary grandfather paradox, except the change in the past is induced by the movement of the present, right? Remember, changing the past is just making something that is a part of the past no longer, right? And if the past in this case involves the year 2000, it goes from being a part of the past that Tim's a time traveler, right, that he traveled from the year 2040 to the year 2000, to not being a part of the past, that he traveled from the year 2040 to the year 2000, right? So it seems to induce a contradiction. Here, it's true in 2000, both true and false in the year 2000, that Tim is a time traveler, or at least intuitively that seems to be the case. Yeah? If you could only move back in time from the present, then there'd be no problem, right? But in order for that to be the case, you have to impose a fairly heavy restriction on the way that time travel works. You would have to say that, only the branch that's going to become physically realized is the one that you can travel backwards through time from, but that's going to mean that the laws of physics on that branch are different to the laws of physics on these other branches, it seems to me. Or at least that's the direction it's going to be going in. And I'm not sure you want to say that. I'm not sure that the proponent of this model of time wants to bite down on that bullet. Sam?
I can't remember what you call him, but the guy's at 2040.
Tim.
From his point of view, all the branches have all dropped off and all never existed. So when he goes back, they still never existed.
No, because this is 2040 when the present is here, right? So remember, the branch attrition view says that when the present is here, all of these branches exist, right? Which means that there's a time traveler existing on this branch in 2040. When the present moves on, then he disappears, but before the present moves on, he travels through time. Yeah.
So when he travels back in time, he causes a different branch to come into being, which makes the branch that he originally time traveled from exist and not exist.
I don't think you have to say that he brings into existence another branch, right? All he does is he travels back in time and makes it the case that there's a time traveler in 2000, right? And then when the branch moves on, it's just false that he's a time traveler because that branch never existed, right? He's just someone walking around claiming to be a time traveler, but he's wrong, right? He goes from being correct to being wrong, right? Just seems to me to be as contradictory as you could want.
Would it be the case that whenever the president chooses to go along another path rather than go back up that path, would he disappear? Just not exist anymore?
But that would be just as bad, right? Because if he exists here, right, when the present is there, but then when the present gets to the end of the cycle, he doesn't exist, right? Then it's both true and false that he exists in the year 2000. It's a contradiction. Right, was there a question somewhere over here, Claire?
Oh, I decided that there wasn't.
Okay. All right. So this is paradoxical. In 2000, before the present has reached 2040, Tim is a time traveler. In 2000, after the present has reached 2040, Tim is not a time traveler. He just claims to be one. But Tim both is and is not a time traveler. But you might say, who cares, right? Branch attrition view is a silly view anyway. Okay. Is this really that much of a problem? Well, once you see the problem in the branch attrition view, I think it's not that hard to see the problem in other views as well, like in the growing block view, right? So the problem's a little bit different here. So imagine that, what have I got? Yeah. So a man named Tim shows up in 2000 claiming to be a time traveler, right? In 2000, before Tim's future self has come into existence, Tim's not a time traveler, right? There is no future... bugger. So in the year 2000, before the block has grown, right, to encompass the future, Tim is not a time traveler. He's just someone wandering around in the year 2000 claiming to be a time traveler. After all, the future doesn't exist. There's nothing from the future that can travel back in time to the present, right? Because it seems like, you know, in order for something to travel back in time to the present, that thing has to at least exist. But the glowing block person says that future things don't exist, right? So at year 2000, there's someone wandering around claiming to be a time traveler, and he's wrong, right? But then the block moves on, and the block grows. And in the course of the growth of the block, a man named Tim, in 2040, steps into a time machine and travels back to 2000, right? Turns out to be the same guy. So in this case, what's happened is that in the year 2000, Tim was claiming to be a time traveler, and he was wrong. And then once the year 2040 has been attached to the block, it turns out that in the past, Tim was right to say that he's a time traveler. So in the year 2000, Tim is both right to say that he's a time traveler and he's wrong to say that he's a time traveler. Contradiction, right? It's the sort of reverse case to the branching case. Yeah?
So does this come about because it's basically a future truth maker problem?
Yeah, interesting thought. Is it just a future truth maker problem? So if you could maybe make the case that it's true now that in the future someone will travel back to year 2000, right? Is that the sort of idea? Then it is true, even before the blocks moved on, that Tim is a time traveler in the year 2000.
He's also older than himself in the year 2000.
Why is he older than himself in the year 2000?
He pops into existence, lives for 40 years, and then goes back in time. Like, he re-inhabits his own body, right? Like, this isn't two Tims walking around concurrently in the year 2000, is it?
It's supposed to be two Tims walking around in the year 2000, right? So, or no Tim at all, right? So maybe Tim is born in the year 2008, right? And he's 32 when he travels back. And then, but he always existed as a 32-year-old in the past. Yeah? And so at that time, the 32-year-old Tim, which is a part of this space-time continuum, which has wrapped back on itself, both is a time traveler when the block is here and is not a time traveler when the block is there. Yeah. So Tim's not born yet. That's just future Tim coming back to check out the past. It becomes the case that it was true later on. Though it's not like the ball case. In the ball case, it will become true that there's a ball in the room, right? At some future time, there is a ball in the room. In this case, it's at some past time. It will become true at that past time that Tim's a time traveler. I mean, the tense is a little bit icky here, right? Because we're using iterated tenses. It will be the case that it was, or it was the case that it will be. But I think that iterated tenses are perfectly coherent, right? And I think that's what marks the difference between that and the just the ordinary case of a ball coming into existence. Kyle still looks worried, so maybe well, I will say something anyway to address the merely possible Kyle who's still worried. I like to keep your counterparts happy, because God knows when one of them is going to slide into this world and kill me. You remember that show, Sliders? Yeah, there you go. That was a shit show. It's not good TV. No. Okay, so there's a sort of issue here about identity of persons, which is a little bit complicated. So Tim the Time Traveler, there's a question about what sort of thing he is, right? Last time I was talking about perduring objects, right? Perduring objects are these things that have spatial and temporal parts, right? So remember Brody, who, gets involved with World War III, right? He has a temporal part doing things in World War III, and then he has another temporal part later on where he's brought up for his war crimes in World War III. In that case, you can see that the object is sort of smeared out in space and time. Not everyone thinks that that's how objects persist through time, right? Some people think that a persisting object is sort of the whole thing is located at each time at which it exists, right? So you don't have temporal parts, right? When I look at Brody, right, in the Paduring case, I'm not looking at the whole thing, right, because there are temporal parts that I can't see. But on the opposing view, which is often called endurantism, when I look at Brody, I am seeing the whole thing. There are no other temporal parts, right? The sort of whole thing is identical over time. It's only got spatial parts, is another way of putting it. If things only have spatial parts, then time travel cases get a little bit more icky for Tim the Time Traveller when he travels back to a time at which he's located, right? If Tim the Time Traveller doesn't have any temporal parts, then when he travels back to a time at which he existed, right, then we can't sort of account for the case by saying there's a part of him, there's sort of two temporal parts of him that are spatially close to each other because he doesn't have temporal parts. You sort of end up saying that the whole thing is sort of spatially bilocated or something like that, and it gets quite messy. So that might be what is a little bit confusing about this case, is that if you think of this as a Paduring object, it's fine. But if you think of it as enduring, as something that doesn't have temporal parts, then it can be quite difficult to understand how time travel cases work, I think. Yep. Yeah, it's a foregone conclusion.
Are we then saying that now Brody has sort of committed crimes in terms of the fact that he's already, all of his temporal parts are already there, so he's already...
No. It's not the case that all of his temporal parts are there. You say that he has no temporal parts, right? He will commit war crimes. By that, his spatial parts will, do something horrible in the future. Look at his eyes, that cold, dead stare. I mean, if that doesn't terrify you, I don't know what will. Sorry, Brody. All of his spatial parts in the future will do something horrible. All of his spatial parts here are sitting here listening to this lecture, right? But it's not the case that all of his temporal parts from the future are sort of somehow located here. It's just the case he doesn't have any temporal parts. Some people think it's just an issue of, yeah. Some people think it's just an issue of semantics, but there's sort of heavy weather made about this issue as to whether it is just a matter of semantics to say that sort of the whole thing is located at a particular time. It's just that, the whole thing persists, or whether the whole thing is actually the sort of full four-dimensional worm that has temporal parts, right? It may be an issue of semantics. Some people certainly think it is, but many people argue that there's a genuine metaphysical distinction there. I'm not sure which way to go. I kind of like Padurantism, so I just hope that endurantists will be quiet one day. All right. So you might think, but these are problems for the branch view and the growing block view. But those are silly views. Presentism is the view that we all love, right? Presentism is our favorite view, right? Are there any problems with time travel when you're a presentist? Well, I think that there might be. And some people have argued that time travel is actually kind of incoherent if you're a presentist. Why? Because the past doesn't exist, right? If the past doesn't exist, and you say, I'm going to get in this machine which takes me to the past, right? You might think that that machine is not taking you to the past at all. That machine is just wiping you out, right? Because there is no past to travel to. It's some elaborate form of suicide, right? So is it a time machine, or is it just a suicide booth, right? So if someone offers you a time machine and then they follow that up with, by the way, presentism is true, right? Would you get into the time machine, right? Who would get into the time machine, just out of interest? 3 people would get into the time machine. You just want to find out what happens. What happens if... Well, no. That's right. They've given you the time machine and they've said that presentism is true. Right? I want to say no. But if we return to a moment for our favorite cautionary tale, Alexius Meinong, which is a pretty awesome name. Wish I had a good name. Philosophers should have a good name, right? Alexius Meinong, Willard Quine. Good names. Elizabeth Anscombe. If Meinong's right and there are things that don't exist, there might be people that don't exist. And the past might be populated by them. If the past is populated by people that don't exist, maybe when you step into the time machine, you can travel into the past by becoming a Meinongian object, right? By shedding your property of existence. Ah, finally I'm free. No longer constrained by the bounds of existence, I wander through the Meinongian jungle. I would still worry if someone offered me this choice. But presentists have got something to say here. They do try and get around this problem. And this comes back to what Brodie was saying about, isn't this a truth maker problem in the growing block theory, right? Isn't it the case that if in the future it will be the case that someone travels back, and that's true now, right? Isn't it perfectly acceptable to say that the person is a time traveler? Yeah, Trilo.
What about if you travel in the future? Would you kind of travel out of existence and then come back into existence and
Yes. I think that's what the presentist would have to say, right? So you oh, man. It's not just a suicide booth, right? This is like weirdest day of your life booth. So you travel into the future, and you pop out of existence, and then you wait around for the present to catch up. And then you come back into existence, and you're like, oh, thank God for that. Feel sorry for the people that went in the other direction. Unless it cycles back around, yeah, but presentists don't usually think that it does. So here's the presentist solution, right? All you need is truth. Beatles had it wrong. In fact, all you need are truth makers, right? So as long as it's true that it was the case that you stepped out of the time machine in the past, right? And after all, if the presentists can have truths about the past, why can't they have those truths about the past? If they can have those truths about the past and they can tell an appropriate truth-making story, big if, but, you know, let's give it to the presentists. They've got some options, right? Maybe it's a tense property now of the world that, you know, it was the case that you stepped out of the time machine. If they can have those truths, then why can't they say that you've traveled through time? Why isn't it sufficient to have traveled through time for it to be true that you stepped out of the time machine in the past and for it to be true now that you've stepped into the time machine, right? Why isn't that sufficient?
Does the presentist have an alternative option saying what our time machine does is instead sort of rewind the present? So instead of saying you move into non-existence and wait for the present to catch up, instead it's not what your time machine does. I know it's really random, but we're there anyway.
But what happens to everyone else, right? So, that's right. So in the first time machine, you kill yourself, right? This is the time machine where you travel into the past that doesn't exist, right? You kill yourself. The second time machine, where you drag the present with you, you kill everyone you left behind.
We're not talking morals.
Right?
I don't think it's a good thing. All I'm saying is
But okay, let's entertain the possibility. Thinking this is actually quite similar to the time machine that creates branches, right? Because think about the power of this machine now. This machine is not just transporting you through time. It is rewinding the entire temporal sequence of the universe in terms of the moving present, right?
and keeping you objective.
And
at the same time.
that's right, and keeping you attached to the thing that it's moving and not moving too far, right? Because, you know, it takes you far enough into the past, then you might have some problems. Yeah, look, I just don't think we've got any reason to think that machines like that are possible, right? And I think that if you're thinking about time travel and time machines, then we should at least be constrained by physical possibility when we're dealing with this. Yeah, I think we've got, well, maybe not machines, but I think time travel is possible. I think that's just fairly straightforward, actually. You know, I'm a time traveler.
On that, if we do have like a massive deleting
Yeah.
machine, where it would
Massive
travel
deleting machine.
into the future,
Yeah.
what would happen to the time in between? Like, would that just have passed that once existed that you weren't in, or would there just be kind of a void of space? Does that make sense?
Yeah, this actually touches on exactly what time travel would involve, right? If time travel just involves a kind of continuous path, like a closed causal loop, where you sort of set off in a trajectory through space-time at a particular velocity and you end up wrapping back on yourself through space-time, then or when you rewind it, I suppose. Well, I don't know. I think it would be bad. Yeah, it would probably involve some kind of void through which you don't exist.
That's how black holes.
Yeah, I mean this is like worse than the moving gap now, I fear. This is a void of a whole different kind. Okay, but that's the solution the presentist offers, right? Recover truths about the past, and you recover time travel, right? But and what they say is that there's not really a new problem here, right? It looks like it's one of two problems. Either it's the truth maker problem, right? How can it be true now that you stepped out of a time machine in the past? Well, provide some truth makers, off you go, right? Or it's a problem of relations. How did you get to the past, right? How did you cause the past to happen such that you're there kicking around in the past? That would just be the sort of problem of relations again, except with causation running in the other direction, backwards causation, right? I feel that if presentists can tell a story about relations and about causation, why can't they have a story about backwards causation that works just as well? So if they can have backwards causation and they can have truths about the past, why can't they have time travel? Still, I ask you, would you step into a time machine if presentism were true? Zach, question.
I was just going to say, like, if you did rewind the present state,
Yeah.
wouldn't that effectively have like the same kind of effect as kind of moving consciousness back in the past? Like,
No, it would have a much greater effect than that.
but would it really wipe anybody else out?
Yes.
Can you kill them if they never existed? Because technically what you're making them is that they've never existed.
Like, but I mean, like,
That's
say-
true,
say-
yeah.
Say you could only like then move back,
Not a killer.
move back, like within your own life. If that makes sense, you could only move your consciousness back.
Yeah, but you would still, like, as long as the objective present goes with you, right? You take out of existence all of the things that were present before you left.
They would
right?
come back into existence.
Oh, they would later on. They would come. It seems like cold comfort, right?
It makes it odd though. There's no real later on. Like,
It's like you cleaned up the house after you've had your party and broken everything. It's alright.
Yeah, I mean, and they may not come back into existence, because actually what's interesting about these sort of, like, grab the present, stick it in your backpack and move with you when you travel through time, is that you probably can change the past in the sort of extreme way that we're interested, that I said was impossible, right? If you can, like, rewind the sort of sum total of things that exist, taking out of existence all of the presentist things that came into existence and then ending up at some time in the past, I don't see why you couldn't kill your grandfather in that situation.
but then wouldn't it killing be what takes them out of existence rather than rewinding? So like, if you
Oh, no, the rewinding is not taking him out of existence. The rewinding is just getting you back to a time at which he existed. Then you kill him, and that's what takes him out of existence.
That's what I mean. So like, when you just rewind, are you really taking all these people out of existence? Surely it's your actions once you have rewinded that you take these people out of existence.
Yeah, I don't know.
If you went back and took exactly the same actions, somehow, like, the first remember you acted like in an identical manner
Yeah.
to the way you
And then they come back into existence. Yeah.
So surely it's only your actions which would then...
Look, okay, so the idea is, you throw them into Minong's jungle for a while, but they come back. I still wouldn't like to be thrown into that jungle even for a little while, right?
You would know. That's my point. It's like, you can't be thrown in there for a while. Like,
Yes, you can.
Why would that be bad? Like, isn't
Why would that be bad?
if the present is just now and that's all that exists,
Yeah.
then, like everything else across time doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So it's stupid to think that it's bad to say that things don't exist. Presentism is true. Like, it's
But
like
they-
almost everything doesn't exist.
But they will exist, and they did exist, right?
Yeah, but
Well, as,
Your dead past self.
it seems bad, right? I mean, there are all these things that are existing. You take some action,